So, welcome everyone to Beyond the Buzzwords, the science and practice of trauma-informed care. BSBSA, in partnership with the American Academy of Pediatrics, is excited to host today's CME. Today's speakers are Dr. Heather Forkey and Dr. Moira Szilagyi. Dr. Forkey is a professor of pediatrics at the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School and vice chair of pediatrics and director of the Foster Children's Evaluation Service of the UMass Memorial Children's Medical Center. She also serves as the pediatric director for Lifeline for Kids at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. In addition to her clinical work, she has been the recipient of local and federal grants to address issues of children in foster care and translate promising practices to address physical and mental health needs of children who have been traumatized. She has published and presents nationally and internationally on these topics and serves in leadership roles for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the Massachusetts chapter and National American Academy of Pediatrics on issues related to foster care, mental health, and child trauma. She co-authored the book Childhood Trauma and Resilience, A Practical Guide, available from AAP Press. Dr. Szilagyi is a primary care pediatrician, educator, and professor of pediatrics at UCLA, where she is a division chief of developmental behavioral pediatrics and also Peter Shapiro term chair for the promotion of child developmental and behavioral health. Dr. Szilagyi has worked closely with the AAP for 3 decades. In the 1990s, she led a multidisciplinary team that developed the first healthcare standards for children in foster care, Fostering Health, which now serves as national standards. She has served in leadership roles for the AAP's Committee on Early Childhood, Task Force on Foster Care, and Council on Foster Care, Adoption and Kinship Care. She has authored several AAP policy statements, clinical and technical reports, and speaks widely about child welfare, vulnerable children, and childhood trauma and resilience. She is also a co-author of Childhood Trauma and Resilience, A Practical Guide. So starting with our learning objectives, upon completion of this activity, learners will be able to identify the developmental and health impacts of trauma, discuss a practical approach to trauma-informed care, and apply strategies to manage trauma symptoms and promote resilience. This activity is accredited for continuing education credits by the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning in partnership with BCBSA. Credit is available for physicians, pharmacists, nurses, and case managers. This educational activity was planned and produced in accordance with CME standards for integrity and independence in accredited continuing education. Today's presenters do have financial relationships that are disclosed here. And we're going to take a second for people to read the disclaimers. And we'll put this up at the end as well, but how to receive credit, please visit www.achlcme.org and enter the certificate code provided at the end of today's webinar. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to our experts for this very important topic. Thank you.
And I'm going to, all right. So Heather and I are here today to talk to you about the science and the practice of trauma-informed care. And why even talk about it? Well, we know that trauma is very prevalent. 2/3 of adults report experiencing at least one episode of adversity and trauma in their childhood. We know from medicine and health and years of research that they can have long-term effects, negative effects on individuals. And there is something we can do about it that is rooted in science. But when we talk about trauma-informed care, we're often talking about the principles of care, which are underlying and foundational and extremely important. But they don't necessarily easily translate into the how we do this, which is where we're going to focus a little bit today. I know many of you are probably familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which I think taught us all something we might have already known, which is that what happens in childhood, for good or ill, does not stay in childhood. This study asked adults about 10 intrafamilial or in-household forms of adversity, including 5 forms of abuse and neglect, and also things that can really affect parenting. Parent mental illness, violence and conflict in the home, or parental substance use were among those. And The study was also really important. It was a large population study, and it showed that at the population level, that as the ACE score increased from 0 to 10, you simply counted up your exposures over time in childhood, that as the dose or the burden of ACEs increased, the prevalence of poor mental health, and social outcomes in adulthood also increased. And it made it very necessary that we find some way as health providers to intervene, particularly in childhood, to prevent this long-term damage. So trauma-informed care really evolved out of the ACE study, but it is not the same as ACE screening. And ACE screening is not trauma-informed care. Since this time, the original 10 ACEs are not the only adversities that can accumulate and lead to poor outcomes in adulthood. So there's a long list here. There are probably more by now. But felt racism and discrimination, being bullied, living in dire poverty, exposure to significant community violence, and so on, all have the same effects on long-term health and well-being of original ACEs. So basically, to summarize, the costs of inaction in childhood are or can be those ongoing negative impacts on multiple body systems and resulting in those long-term poor outcomes. The hidden cost. So in addition to the terrible cost to individuals from childhood adversity, the CDC did a study showing that the financial costs are terrible to society and to our healthcare system. They showed in a 2023 article looking at a large population of adults who had experienced at least one ACE that the annual cost of ACEs, having at least one ACE in adulthood, was $14.1 trillion a year, and $183 billion of that was attributable to direct annual medical costs. We also know that not everyone with a high ACE score has poor outcomes. In fact, a majority of those in the original ACE study with a score of 4 or more ACEs actually had good outcomes, or what we might call resilient outcomes. So how do we explain why some individuals emerge resilient and others emerge with poor outcomes? In order to understand this, we need to understand a little bit about the body's stress response systems. Our brains have an alarm system, the amygdala, that is always scanning for danger. When it senses danger, it begins the activation of a primitive, highly reactive stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary or HPA axis. This system was really crucial to our ancestors' physical survival when they lived in caves and forests. When the amygdala senses threat and it activates that system, it does so in a split second. And when the danger is real, it causes an actual flood of hormones through that system, our sympathetic hormones from our adrenal gland and cortisol. This activates our fight, flight, or freeze responses, enabling us to escape danger and increasing our chance of survival. We still have this very primitive system in our brain. And I want you to note that there is a fourth to the right, a fourth response system called the affiliate response, because we're going to talk about that too. In the past, as we spent millennia literally living in more dangerous settings, being able to quickly recognize friend or foe was really important because, in fact, a mistake could have been deadly. So that fourth response, the affiliate response, is mediated by a hormone called oxytocin, known as a relationship hormone. It's really crucial. It turns out that when the amygdala senses danger, a small amount of oxytocin is released from our posterior pituitary. This hormone actually increases our social salience, our ability to better identify a safe versus an unsafe social context or setting. When the context is unsafe, that is when the fight, flight, and freeze responses or the survival responses are activated in response to that unsafe setting. This enables us to engage in thoughts and actions that will help us to protect ourselves. These are our distress responses. And I'm going to borrow a line from dating apps. It enables our brain to shift left. The AAP also published a policy statement on toxic stress in 2012, in which they talked about child brain development, social relationships, and stress responses. It turns out that a little bit of stress, positive stress, increases all those hormones briefly and enables us to learn and grow. It kind of stimulates us into action, right? Children can also tolerate more significant stress, such as the death of a close family member, even bullying, or a natural event like a hurricane blowing through, as long as they have buffering and supportive relationships to rely on. Those same stressors, or any prolonged stress or significant stress, can, however, become toxic when the child does not have those protective, buffering relationships to rely on. And for young children in particular, that's usually their parents or other close relatives that they are leaning on. So what happens when the child does have a safe buffering relationship to lean on? When oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary in that context, and the child is better able to look around, see that they have buffering relationships, then the flood of oxytocin suppresses the stress responses, those survival stress responses, and enables the child to engage in actions that will actually facilitate support from others in ways that will, over time, build their adaptive stress responses. So the key here is that affiliate stress response, or in this case, the brain is shifting right because of those relationships that the child has to rely on. So while trauma kind of hijacks the thinking and learning and affiliate structures of the brain, the presence of buffering relationship enables children to regulate emotions, behavior, and attention. So we have, in summary, long understood that childhood trauma can certainly lead to negative outcomes, but most children and their families are resilient and do well. We know that adversity is not destiny, that despite significant adversity, positive outcomes are possible. And that key really lies in those buffering relationships, in those caring connections that support and protect the developing child, helping them to heal and actually grow and develop. So let's return to what happens without those affiliate supports. As we said, the brain shifts left. Overstimulation of that HPA axis can affect multiple body systems. We're just going to focus on 3 of them: brain growth and development and connectivity, immune function, and epigenetics, which is gene expression. I'm going to focus on brain first, probably the most important organ in the body. And we're going to focus on 3 parts of the brain. The amygdala, as I've already said, is the brain's alarm system, always scanning for danger. It gets input from multiple body systems, including our sensory, memory, and attention systems. When danger is perceived, it also is part of our emotional memory system, because a danger that is real, perceived, and acted upon is often co-occurring with a smell, a sound, a touch, or a sense of place. And so this stores that memory. And sometimes if that smell, sound, taste, or touch is, again, experienced, it can activate those stress responses. It's kind of a shortcut to survival. Just to go back for a minute, in a child who lives in a home in which there is not that buffering support available and their brain is often on alert, this amygdala or alarm system not only enlarges, it can become hypersensitized and may even perceive threat when none is present. The hippocampus lies in the midbrain. This has a major role in memory and learning. It is the brain's file cabinet, or we can think about it as a search engine. When we have a new experience or an experience and we've had a similar experience before, it helps for us to be able to search and see how we might have managed that and to build on the skills that we used the first time. In children who live in frequent danger without buffering support, this can actually shrink or go offline because it's not as useful in times of danger or stress. The prefrontal cortex, which is in the higher brain, is responsible for executive functions, including our ability to control or regulate our emotions and behaviors and attention. It's the home of work flexibility, which are both very important for learning and growth in that area. The prefrontal cortex is also less necessary when one lives in a dangerous environment, and this area of the brain also can shrink and go offline. So putting it all together, these changes, which can be adaptive to the current environment the child is in, if that is one that is somewhat dangerous or potentially dangerous, are actually adaptive. So the alarm system is hypersensitive, but these learning and regulating thinking parts of the brain may go offline. So the child has adapted to the dangerous environment they're living in, but one might consider the ability to respond quickly through fight, flight, or freeze may not always be adaptive in other situations, such as a school classroom or a childcare setting. And I would be remiss if I did not mention sleeping. Poor sleep is often one of the first symptoms that we hear about when children are experiencing symptoms of stress, or adults even. And this results from activation of those brain centers that increase our alertness or our wakefulness, such as the reticular activating system. This is, again, adaptive when one is living with threat. Just a brief stop by the immune system. As anybody here who is a parent knows, young children are frequent experiencers of colds and infections, and so their developing immune system is kind of chronically pressed into action. Excessive cortisol, which is what happens when one has frequent stress responses, suppresses humoral antibodies that help us to fight off infection. The inflammatory response is the other part of the immune system. This is kind of the wound healing part of the immune system. This is more active in individuals who are experiencing these toxic stress responses, and it can often persist even if it's no longer needed, and can actually set up the human body for the development of later inflammatory diseases such as cardiovascular disease. These children also are the ones who often come to us not feeling well, hard to find a cause. They can complain of different kind of varying pains, such as headaches, tummy aches, or joint pains, or muscle aches. And we often attribute it to stress, and it turns out we're not really so far off. Epigenetics, or gene expression. So we are all born with a genetic code that is constant throughout our lifetime. However, gene expression changes over time because this is how we adapt to the environment. In young children, development is actually really dependent upon this ability of our genetic code to express different genes in response to the environment. When children grow up in a typical nurturing home and have exposure to a variety of normal activities and resources, they pretty much develop typically, and their brain development follows a rather typical pathway in adaptation to that environment. However, for children who lack those buffering relationships and whose environments are more deprived or more hostile, their pattern of gene expression varies. And that unbuffered stress is what they're adapting to. And that leads to those body changes that I've already talked about, with the brain development and immune system development, but also ultimately affects emotional regulation, mental health, and other body systems such as our cardiovascular system and even our microbiome. And it's not just that that happens and the biology ensues, but we know from the studies of maltreated children that these children continue to have more stressful experiences. There's kind of a compounding or stress generation that happens. Maltreated children are more likely to be bullied or victimized by classmates, and more likely to experience conflict and abuse in platonic or romantic relationships as adults. This is not random chance, but inadvertently, or it does not inadvertently happen. It is stress generation that occurs through learned responses in the body and adaptive responses in the body. So remember that when oxytocin is released and the context is unsafe, that if this happens over and over again, relational trauma can lead to chronic activation of those stress responses, changes in the human brain, and then more negative social interactions for a child who is avoiding potentially dangerous relationships or who is more highly activated in the face of danger. This tends to alienate people, leading to social thinning over time, which in itself can become a form of stress generation as a child lacks the buffering supports that would help them to adapt. So from the literature, we know that those with a history of relational trauma have a different quantity and quality of relationships, fewer social contacts in childhood, as even with same age peers. As adults, they have less social support from family and friends. And adults with a history of maltreatment are more likely to report experiencing loneliness. So stress generation and social thinning due to these effects on the brain may be initially adaptive, keeping a child safe from danger. The threat system, which is activated, is helpful. It's adaptive initially. And even the impairment of the reward system and the autobiographical memory system can be somewhat adaptive, but over the long term, they are maladaptive. For the reward system, children may not learn those behaviors that would elicit positive rewards, because for them, it may be dangerous to seek touch or cuddle or food from a caregiver who is not safe or nurturing. When the child isn't motivated to follow rules and norms to gain social rewards, this can frustrate and alienate others, such as child caregivers and educators. And it can lead to real social thinning over time. As relationships break down, people tend to distance themselves and their social world becomes much more impoverished. So that initial adaptive response can become quite maladaptive in life. The development of our sense of self begins in infancy. We basically develop our sense of self in the context of our relationships with others. If that relationship is negative, or neglectful, the sense of self that develops is overwhelmingly negative. Memory may be very vague. Having a vague memory protects one from frightening memories, but it also doesn't enable a child to build a good sense of self. May not even know how we manage social situations in the past, which makes it even harder to negotiate new situations and solutions. So that leads to some stress generation. And those lack of skills to cultivate and maintain relationships leads to that social thinning. So trauma-informed care can shift this trajectory. And this is why I think that both Heather and I have become so committed to this work. Not only is trauma-informed care a care in which we understand the effects of trauma on individuals, we also know how to respond to those children and families in ways that can promote healing. Trauma-informed care is basically a frame shift. It's a relational approach to care that's rooted in this affiliate response and enables us to focus at the individual family level on building the parent-child relationship to prevent or ameliorate the effects of trauma. And so now we're going to shift to Heather to discuss the frame shift.
Great. Thank you, guys. Laura did such a great job with that science. And so now we're going to talk about how do we incorporate this into the clinical care that we provide? Because relational health supports are what change outcomes. And so providing this trauma-informed care really becomes a critical way to practice medicine. Next slide. You know, what Moira has brought up are basically 3 frame shifts. And it's changing our perspective in medicine from what's wrong with you to asking the question, what happened to you? And yet, as she's sort of alluded to, ironically, it's not really about summing up or counting up the number of bad things that have happened to someone, but it's about building the buffering. And fundamentally, it's about we in medicine recognizing and treating the effects of trauma. And so we can sort of shift these around to think about primary prevention, secondary response, and tertiary treatment, which is how we think about the way we organize healthcare. Primary prevention is about building that buffering. The secondary response is always thinking about trauma, thinking that if you hear about trauma, you're going to ask about symptoms. If you hear about symptoms, you're going to wonder, is this related to trauma? And tertiary treatment, recognizing and treating the effects of trauma. Isn't the social work job alone? It isn't people outside of medicine. It is our job within medicine. Next slide. Yeah, I think legitimately people can say, hey, Forky, Szilagyi, I don't have infinite time. What can I do? What can I do with the time I have? And I think that's what we do in medicine all the time. We triage and we think about what do we do if we have just a very little bit of time. And next slide, I think fundamentally what we do when we have the least time is we say, who are the most severely impacted and how can I get them the help that they need? So if we think about this in terms of trauma-informed care, we're starting with that tertiary response. How do we do that? I think in a vacuum, a number of folks have said, I've heard about this ACE screening tool that the ACE study was built on. Let me use that. And yet this was never developed as a clinical screening tool. It has validity in populations, not in individuals. These are questions about history, but it's a very limited, specific history. There's no predictive value for thresholds. There's no specificity. And fundamentally, if you're just asking about what people experienced, you're not identifying whether they were impacted such that their health has been challenged by that, or whether they had the opportunity for buffering and for that affiliate response. And so there hasn't been the same impact on their health. So it's not a great clinical tool. And I think more recently, people have been asking the question, could it even cause some harm? There's a number of studies where people who've been asked to complete this study have become frustrated, saying, I'm not a number. I am not the sum of the bad things that have happened to me. They may not feel safe completing this and ultimately may disrupt trust in the relationship with the healthcare provided, which has caused the CDC to urge caution in its use. And so I think people then say, okay, well, what should I do instead? Well, if you just have a minute, you can do what we do in medicine all the time. We just ask an open-ended question. We often say, hey, what brings you to see me today? Or how can I help? We can, from a trauma-informed perspective, ask, has anything bad, scary, or upsetting happened since we last met or happened at all? Many people turn to Dr. Szilagyi and myself and say, okay, but if I have to ask just one question, is there a really good one? And I would say, one of the good questions to ask that helps to get at this information is, has anyone come or gone from the household lately? You would be amazed at what comes up, that maybe a child has gone off to college, or that a partner has left, that a grandparent has died, or that the whole family has moved. And these are all significant stressors and even causes of trauma. Next slide. But we all know that using a screening tool gets us much better and much more accurate information. And so there are screening tools specifically for trauma symptoms that ask about exposure or those events and pair it with symptoms. And in particular, we have an example here that was created by our colleagues at Intermountain Health. Next slide. It's called the Pediatric Traumatic Stress Screening Tool. You can download it from this website for free. Here we have a picture of the tool for young children, 6 to 10 years old, but there's another version for older kids to complete themselves. And it's actually incredibly easy to use. It has questions at the top asking open-ended questions about bad things that may have happened. And then it takes the symptoms of PTSD and organizes the questions so that you can group symptoms. So next slide. What you see is that by just scanning down the tool, you can identify, and if you just keep clicking through, you'll see that we can identify if a patient is having sleep problems, having hypervigilance or intrusive symptoms, or having avoidance and negative mood symptoms. And critically, this screening tool incorporates the suicidality question from the PHQ-9. And we do know that suicidal ideation is much higher in patients who've experienced trauma. So it's an important question to have in your armamentarium. Scoring this screen is also incredibly easy. I don't usually you can get a number, which will tell you if symptoms are mild, moderate, or severe, but you can see that just by scanning the tool, you can glance at it and see, is this a patient who has mild symptoms, moderate, or severe symptoms, which already begins to guide what are you going to do. Can you provide some office-based guidance, or do you need to refer this patient on for more specific care? Next slide. And what is it that you are going to offer those patients? And since that screening was so easy to do and only took you 3 minutes, there is time to respond to these symptoms in the brief time that you have with this patient. We're going to start with some advice to start at home, and then we're going to think about whether we need to refer this patient and follow that up. For the advice to start at home, we have a handy dandy resource for you at the American Academy of Pediatrics that you can download. You keep it in your office. You can send it home with families, but we call it the 3 R's. And these are the things that you start with. You know, when we are dealing with a lot of medical issues, we have sort of a quick way to start to address the symptoms. When we think about a patient who comes in with a musculoskeletal injury, we say RICE, rest, ice, compress, and elevate. And we use this for patients who have a mild injury, and we also use it for patients with a more significant injury who are going to need to kind of manage things at home until they can get in to see a specialist. Here, the 3 R's are reassure, return to routine, and regulate. And reassuring is really just doing that, letting the child know that they are safe, and doing it with words, with touch, with hugs, with creating safe spaces in the home, like a tent or a bed that has a nice weighted blanket on it. The next R is to return to routine. We know that routines make the world predictable, and things that are predictable are safe. If you think about danger is always unpredictable. And so getting back to something that is predictable creates a sense of safety for kids. Next slide. The one thing that we forget is the value of ritual, I think. We talk about routine a lot in medicines, bedtime routines, eating meal routines, but rituals are a part of human existence. We have rituals that we have in terms of holidays and seasons, but incorporating rituals is also something that people do when they have to do something hard. Think about sports players that you have watched. They often have a little ritual that they do before they do their event. So Serena Williams bounces her ball 5 times before her first serve, 3 times before her second serve, always. That rituals is something easy and expected and routine, and it calms you down before you have to do something more difficult. So for a kid who's having a hard time going to school, 2 fist pumps and a high five as they go out the door. For kids who are having had a frightening experience, making sure that we build in Friday movie night, or that there's a point in the day that we always do deep breathing together and exercises, that we always do that together. Which gets me to the 3rd R, which is regulation, calming that stress response, learning some language for it. Again, none of this is new for those of you who've done medicine. We talk about meditation, belly breathing, and this is sort of more of what you already know. But what I will point out is that each one of these is stimulating a part of our own physiology, which is part of calming mechanisms. When we have a mindful meal, we are sucking and swallowing. Sucking and swallowing is our most primitive calming mechanism. In fact, if you're having a stressful meeting with people, hand out bottles of water, have everyone take a sip, and everyone will calm down a little bit. Squeezing muscles stimulates deep proprioceptive centers, which are part of our calming mechanisms. Why do hugs feel good? Well, it's the very same reason. So squeezing your muscles is like giving your own body a hug. And so again, teaching families to do these calming regulation techniques, but also explaining to them that it's not just woo-woo stuff, that it really has to do with physiology and teaching the body to calm down and regulate. Next slide. For some families, giving just advice to do at home isn't going to be enough. You're going to want to refer to a specialist. We do that all the time in medicine. We don't handle everything. We send people off to cardiology specialists and neurology specialists. Here, we want to get families to evidence-based trauma therapy. And there are specific therapies depending on the age and the experience of the patient. For young kids, there's therapies that build attunement with the caregiver, parent-child interactive therapy, or child-parent psychotherapy. For older kids who've had a frightening experience, things like trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy or eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing are tools which help to desensitize to the experience and restructure cognitively so that they can move on in a healthy way. And for kids who have had multiple relational traumas, we want to get them to a therapy like attachment regulation and competency, which help work on multiple areas of development and behavior so that these kids can kind of reorganize how they're managing their sense of self, their sense of others, and their sense of ability to manage themselves. Next slide. And with that, in just a few minutes, you've screened, you've given some advice, and you've gotten the most affected patients to the therapy that's going to help them. But what if you have a few more minutes? Because come on, sometimes you do. What you want to do in that circumstance is you want to identify those impacted and get them to help, but you can also think about secondary response. Think about talking to patients where you're hearing about a symptom. Is there trauma? You've heard about a trauma and you want to know more. Could there be some symptoms? So next slide. This is what I say is when we begin to introduce care into trauma-informed work. We're creating safety. And because I love mnemonics, care here stands for using curiosity with acceptance, respect, and empathy. We're asking open-ended questions which get at how we can create this sense of this is safe to talk about. And not only that, this is an important place for us to address what happened. Hey, I'm curious about what you said. Tell me more about that. And then what happened? You know, I wasn't there. So can you tell me more about what that was like for you? When we are hearing about symptoms, sort of putting the idea out there, you know, I wonder if those headaches started when that event that you described happened. We can ask the families, what do they think is going on? And if you're working with kids, make it a little bit whimsical. If you had a magic wand to change something about your situation, what would you do? You know, we also need to remember that physiology that Moira talked about. So make sure that if you ask these open-ended questions, that you're also giving people time to answer by using silence. Say, hey, I'm going to ask you something, but you know what, don't answer me right away. I need to listen to your heart, or I need to type something into the computer. Next slide. The other thing that we can do if we have a few more minutes is we can try to discriminate if what we're hearing about is trauma or is related to some of the conditions that are both sometimes comorbid with trauma or have overlapping symptoms. In particular, anxiety and depression are notoriously difficult to tease apart from trauma. And here again, our colleagues from Intermountain Health have come in and shown us the way to go forward with this. Next slide. What they've done is created a triple screen where they took that traumatic stress tool that I showed you a few minutes ago, and they paired it with the PHQ-A, a depression screener, and the GAD-7, an anxiety screener. And the nice thing about this is that many of us are familiar with doing depression or anxiety screening. But if we don't pair it with trauma screening, we actually may be misidentifying the symptoms we hear about. They've now studied this in over 60,000 patients in primary care and child advocacy centers. And what they found is that when depression screening is done without trauma screening, about half the scores may have been better explained by trauma. If you do anxiety screening, about 2/5 of those anxiety screening scores may actually be better explained by trauma. So it's really important to consider making a tool for yourself which pairs some of these screening tools to help you see, and what am I really seeing with this symptom? Next slide. Once we have heard about symptoms or families have disclosed to us something that's they've experienced, we're also creating safety in how we validate. We can't go forward unless we've reestablished for families this affiliate support. It is frightening for them to share with us what has happened. And we don't want them to go into fight or flight. We want them to know that we are here tending and befriending. So saying things like, thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for being honest with me. Thank you for trusting me with that information. Sometimes when people share, they will present to you a cognitive distortion, like, you know what, it happened, but I deserved it. You know, we don't want to deny their experience, but we do want to help them to think about it in another way. So saying that, say, You don't want to say, no, you didn't deserve it, but you can say something like, I can really understand why you might think that, but I'm so glad you shared this information because I think we can put this all together with what you're experiencing in terms of symptoms and begin to think about it in another way. Next slide. What we can do also is begin to stabilize this patient. And we have, again, another mnemonic because I do love mnemonics. And here what you can do is really say, I think trauma may be the cause. We also want to help the family identify, of all the things that are going on, what is the thing that's most distressing that they want to address first? Sometimes families come in and they say, he's not sleeping and he's acting out in school and, I can't get to work and our household is all disrupted. You know what? Families often need to sort of say, okay, let's do this first. And when families can't decide, I would say start with sleep. When you're doing this work, you're giving families and patients a vocabulary to talk about that concern. You certainly may need to get more information to develop and understand what's going on. But in this process, you are normalizing this as an expected response to an abnormal set of circumstances. There's not something very wrong with this patient. There's something very right with this patient responding in a way that the body does in order to try to keep them safe. And yet, for many of these patients, they do need to get to treatment. And if trauma is the cause, there is a treatment that they can get to, promoting that expectation of recovery. Next slide. All right, if you have 15 minutes, well, here we can really start to work on primary prevention and build that buffering. Next slide. Because this is our little bumper sticker. It's not about summing the suffering, but it is about building the buffering. If Moira and I had one thing we could have everybody do, it is promoting that affiliate support, moving people away from fight or flight and back to the affiliate support that they need to move forward. Next slide. In fact, what's happened is that there's this newer emphasis on relational health, or this ability to develop and sustain safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And I think some families are doing this sort of automatically, but some families need more guidance and support. There's a very interesting new area of research looking not just at the adverse experiences that people have experienced, but next slide, really beginning to look at the value of what's called positive childhood experiences. There's some researchers, including Christina Bethel and her colleagues, who have begun to dig into the literature around things that promote resilience and support kids. And they can identify the experiences kids have in childhood that promote this resilience. And if you look at some of these lists, and this is one of the lists of positive childhood experiences that have been demonstrated to provide resilience and flourishing in kids, and you'll see that really they're about having affiliate supports, feeling your family stood by you in difficult times, able to talk about feelings with your family, feeling safe and protected by adult in your home, supported by friends, and even in your high school. Next slide. For kids and families who need a little bit more guidance around how to promote this resilience, we can talk about ABC, attunement, biobehavioral synchrony, and charting or mapping. What kids and families fundamentally get when they're feeling safe, stable, and nurtured is a caregiver who is tuning into them, who is connecting with them and looking at the world with their mind in mind. That caregiver is not only connecting sort of in terms of thinking about what's going on with the child, but actually their body begins to sync with that child. Their heartbeat matches the child. Cortisol levels match the child. Eye dilations match. That's called biobehavioral synchrony. We see it in childhood, but you know what? We seek opportunities for biobehavioral synchrony throughout our lives. We love to do things like sing together, dance together, even have deep conversations with our friends, because those are the moments in which we have biobehavioral synchrony. Ultimately, that attunement and synchrony allows kids to begin to create a chart or a map of themselves and the world, and begin to understand their own capacity to go forward from this situation. What the affiliate support is doing in a moment of stress and threat is not just helping the child to understand what is the emotion that they're feeling, but to feel like they can manage it. With the support of others, they've got this situation and they are capable of managing the next set of circumstances. And so what we need to do in the healthcare setting is to model attunement, biobehavioral synchrony, and charting or mapping. How do we model that? Next slide. Attuning with families, we have to connect with them and look at the world with their mind in mind. Now, I need to introduce the concept of neuroception. Kids and families are constantly scanning the environment for danger. And that's a process which has been coined neuroception by a researcher named Dr. Porges. And what it means is that even though you think people are concentrating on you, they're actually also scanning the environment for danger, and they're looking for signs of danger. They're listening for signs of danger, and they're smelling for signs of danger. So our tone of voice, our body language, our facial microexpressions are all sending signals. You are safe, you are not safe, and I am connected with you. So high-pitched musical sounds or sounds of safety, low-pitched sounds or sounds of danger. Body language that's open is safe. Facial microexpressions are things that we may not even be aware we're doing. Checking our watch, getting annoyed with the computer are all sending messages that families are not safe when they are with us. Additionally, we need to consider the effect of masks or turning away from families when we're looking at technology, because those are also things that make it harder for families to perceive that we are attuned with them and that they are safe. Next slide. Biobehavioral synchrony in our medical setting starts with what Claudia Gold calls the stance of not knowing. We are looking at the perspective of the patient, holding their mind in our mind. The relationship that we have with them and that they have with their child, that is the patient, the client, or our student. We can do that and express that when we say things like, tell me what that was like for you. Can you tell me more about that? How does that feel? In medicine, we are often quick to draw a conclusion and move on, but families need to know that we are gathering information, trying our best to sink in with them and to understand what's going on for them in their own situation. Next one. And then in how we support them, we are creating their maps of how to go forward. What they need to know is that they are not alone, that this is not something that they don't have any support to manage, that we are on their team, and that team may extend to other members of the community. Can we help them get connected to resources in the community, therapists, school resources, community supports like a pastor or a YMCA that can help them so that they are not managing this all by themselves? They have affiliate supports. Other tools that caregivers can use to attune to the child and to provide that synchrony are those routines and rituals I already mentioned, using those regulation skills with kids that we talked about. Two other things that I want to mention are special time in and play and reading. Special time in is when we talk to families about creating an opportunity in the day when the parent picks the time, and it need only be about 5 minutes. And the child picks the activity, and the caregiver is going to completely focus on the child in the time that they're doing that activity. That allows the child to know that the caregiver is attuned and connected with them, and begins to help that child to begin to re-understand themselves and the world and how to go forward. Play and reading are two good ways to do this. Next slide. But for families who've experienced a lot of threat, they may not understand the value of play or have had experience with play. And play has a profound impact on the brain, promoting trust, joy, and a sense of safety. It also builds skills in recognizing safety. You cannot play with someone and not be attuned with them. If you're creating imaginative worlds, you have to be connected, attuned, and syncing together. Next slide. So what we want to do is talk to families about what we mean about play. We're talking about play that's face-to-face, talking and smiling with each other. We do it with things like blocks and Legos and toy food and toy meals, drawing and painting, playing board games where we're in it together, even sharing videos, doing origami, or reading together. And reading together is a beautiful opportunity to understand what's going on for the characters and how that child is understanding the characters' feelings, how that child would interpret the situation. And again, that caregiver has an opportunity to reorganize that child's sense of self and how to navigate the world. Next slide. So, what can you do to make changes in your practice? If we triage, the first steps are to screen effectively and get the most affected patients to treatment, recognizing that those most impacted by trauma need to be assured that we're starting trauma work even when we have short windows of time. With very little extra time, we can add that care to trauma-informed work: curiosity, acceptance, respect, and empathy. We can layer our screening, we can validate, we can use Splint. We can also begin to add trauma-informed care by doing prevention work that's as easy as ABC. Positive childhood experiences are those that promote that affiliate response, biobehavioral synchrony, and accurate charting or mapping. And you model that in the office by attending to neuroception, promoting a sense of safety, coming to these interactions with a stance of not knowing, without blame or shame, and offering some simple suggestions for families to promote the affiliate response and build that relational health. Next slide. For payers, we need for us to communicate that there is a high prevalence of childhood trauma and adversity, and there are costs if we don't intervene early. We need payers to invest in trauma-informed care training and education for their own personnel and for the pediatric workforce. They need to invest in both primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, paying for trauma symptom screening, even triple screening, and monitoring and measuring child health and mental health outcomes. Next slide. We have a number of resources to help you do this at the AAP website at aap.org/TIC. There's information about trauma-informed care, resources for self-directed learning for clinicians, resources for pediatric residency training, resources for families and caregivers, short videos, podcasts, blogs, and more. But you can also contact us, backslide, at trauma-informed-care@aap.org with questions. I just couldn't remember that off the top of my head. We have references here, and if you have any questions, you're also welcome to reach out to us. Thank you so much.